Sorry is a board game that is based on the ancient cross and circle game Pachisi. Players try to travel around the board with their pieces faster than any other player. Originally manufactured by BCM in England and now by Hasbro, Sorry is marketed for 2 to 4 players, ages 6 through adult. The game title comes from the many ways in which a player can negate the progress of another, while issuing an apologetic sorry. A classic edition of Sorry is currently produced in the US by Winning Moves. Objective: the objective is to be the first player to get all 4 of their color pawns from their start location to their home space. The pawns are normally moved in a clockwise direction, but can be moved backward if directed. Movement of pawns are directed by the drawing of a card. The board game is laid out in a square with 16 spaces per side, with each player assigned his or her own colored start location and home locations offset towards the center, 1 per side. 4 5-square paths, 1 per color, lead from the common outer path towards a player's home and are designated his or her safety zone. On each side are 2 slides, grouping 4 or 5 spaces each. Older versions of Sorry contain a colored diamond space directly 1 space back from each start square, with the rules stating that a pawn of the diamond's color may not move forwards over this square. Instead, a player of that color must diverge from the outer square towards his or her home. Although the diamond and corresponding rule were removed from subsequent printings of the game, the rules of player movement remained the same. History: the earliest variation of today's Sorry can be traced back to England. William Henry Story of Southend-on-Sea filed for a patent. Sorry was registered as a trademark on May 21, 1929. Early games were manufactured by BCM. A Canadian patent followed in 1932. An English patent was granted to the inventor in 1933. It was subsequently trademarked in the UK to Waddington's, the British games manufacturer who sold it from 1934. Sorry was adopted by Parker Brothers in 1934. Hasbro now publishes it, as they purchased Parker Brothers in 1991. Classic rules: each player chooses 4 pawns of 1 color and 1 player is selected to play first. Each player in turn draws 1 card from the stack and follows its instructions. To begin the game, all of a player's 4 pawns are restricted to start. Only a 1 or 2 card can release them to the rest of the board. Playing a 1 or a 2 places a pawn on the space directly outside of start. Playing a 2 does not entitle the pawn to a second space. The Relaxation Start. When a young player is playing, especially when learning the game of Sorry, a relaxation is offered in allowing one of their pawns to be placed on their track start space. This means they don't get bored before they even start, in that they feel a part of things rather than the tedium of waiting for a 1 or a 2, which can be a bit wearisome even for experienced players. A player can jump over any other pawn, landing on the square indicated by the card. However, 2 pawns cannot occupy the same square. A pawn that lands on a square occupied by another bumps that pawn back to its own start. Players cannot bump their own pawns back to start. If the only way to complete a move would result in a player bumping himself, the pawns remain in place and the player loses his or her turn. If a pawn lands at the start of a slide by direct movement or as the result of a switch with the 11 card or a Sorry card, it immediately moves to the last square of the slide. All pawns anywhere on the slide are sent back to their respective starts. The last 5 squares before home are the safety zone. Access is limited to those pawns of the same color. Pawns inside the zone are immune to being replaced by an opponent's pawn with an 11 or a Sorry card. However, a pawn is vulnerable to being forcibly moved backward out of the safety zone. Forced backward moves can cause a pawn to exit the zone. Also, you cannot move your pawn backwards and forwards and count it as a space. No matter what card you have, it is not allowed to move backwards and forwards. The modern game has now 45 cards. A 1996 board from Waddington's has 5 of each card. 2013 edition rule changes. In the 2013 edition, several rules were changed. Each player only has 3 pawns. A pawn can be moved out from start upon any positive number card. A sorry card gives the alternative option of moving forward 4 spaces. The 2 card no longer allows one to pull another card. Furthermore, 2 additional items known as fire and ice were added, and depending on which card is drawn, can be placed on certain pawns on the board, modifying the playing rules for those pawns. In short, fire gives a pawn the ability to move ahead quickly before the player's turn, and ice stops a pawn from being moved at all. There are some corner cases that are not well explained in the rules, such as, what happens to fire if one pawn kills the pawn with fire by landing on its square? Should the fire be set back to out of play, or should it transfer to the attacking pawn? Classic cards and function. The modern deck contains 45 cards, there are 5 1 cards as well as 4 each of the other cards. There are no 6s or 9s, to avoid confusion. The first edition of the game had 44 cards and the extra 1 card was soon introduced as an option for quicker play. Cards are annotated with the following actions. Strategy: players who have a pawn that has not moved too far away from its start area, and draw a card that allows them to move a pawn backward, can elect to move this pawn backward. Move a pawn in such a situation backward enough, and the pawn is suddenly almost home. The 7 can be split. It is often possible to do so such that one of the pieces winds up on a slide, thus increasing the value of this card. It also provides an additional opportunity for pawns to get home, so long as there's another pawn on the board to use up the remaining spaces. All other things being equal, moves that cause a pawn to wind up in front of an opponent's start square are poor choices, due to the high number of cards that allow that opponent to enter. Some feel that leaving a pawn on one's own square just outside start is a poor position to be in since new pawns are blocked from entering play. There are numerous strategies and tactics employed by skilled players. One such strategy is to leave the last pawn in the start square and move the other pawns around the board while waiting for a sorry card. Another smart move requires 2 pawns in play. While marching 1 pawn around the board, a player can leave a second pawn near start, and wait for the 4 card to be drawn and moving the second pawn into position to run quickly home. Due to the 11, 4, and sorry cards, the lead in the game can change dramatically in a short amount of time. Players are very rarely so far behind as to be completely out of the game. This should be considered when playing a sorry, or an 11. Slowing the game down is a risky yet effective move when given the opportunity. Essentially, when a player has the chance to switch with or hit the apparent leader, even though the move will not be to the player's immediate advancement around the board, the move should be made to keep the leader out of safety, and more importantly, out of home. The sorry card is normally the card that is least appreciated from the person who receives the action. Teams. Players can elect to play the game in 2 teams of 2. Red's teammate is always yellow and blue's teammate is always green. The game is then played as if 2 players had 8 pawns each. For example, the yellow player may move a red pawn for any legal move. A 7 card could be split between a yellow pawn and a red one but can still be split between no more than 2 pieces. However, a partner's pawns are not bump-proof if yellow were to draw a sorry card with only red pawns on the board, or land on a red pawn's occupied space, yellow would have to bump its teammate. Once one of the partners has played all of his or her pieces into home, he continues to draw and play cards on his or her turn, if possible, for his or her partner. The first partnership to play all 8 pieces in its home wins. Variations. A variation with more scope for strategy allows for each player to play the card of his or her choice from a hand of pre-dealt cards. This variation is played by shuffling a full deck of sorry cards, and selecting a dealer. 5 cards are dealt face down to each player. Starting player selection is decided by normal play rules. For each turn, a player picks 1 card from his or her hand and plays it face up. Normal rules apply. If a 2 is played, he may play another card. Being unable to play a card after playing a 2 card does not warrant the reshuffle rule, however. If able to play another, he must. At the end of the turn, that player picks up however many cards were played face down. End rules apply. This variation is commonly coupled with point play, noting that it usually produces faster and more aggressive play. Similar to regular game rules, a player must play a card if able. If a player is unable to play a card, that player must discard one card and draw another face down. If the player is able to play a card, the player must do so. If the player is able to play multiple cards, the player may choose freely which one to play. Another version, similar to the above, involves dealing out the entire deck of cards before play starts. The same rules apply as the previous variation except with very different strategy. Namely, it forces players to think about when they play certain combinations of cards. For example, if a player's first move is to lay down a 2 followed by a 4, allowing himself to finish on his or her following turn, his or her opponents would probably stop him or her with a sorry card or an 11, effectively wasting the first player's 2 and 4. Rather than playing a combination like this early in the game, it is often wise to save them until the end, when all the sorry cards and 11s have been played. Note that players who have 2s in their hand will appear to have less cards at the end of each round than players who do not. Bump'em Hoyle Table Games is a computer game consisting of 18 board table games, one of which is Bump'em, a game similar to Sorry. Pawns are represented as bumper cars, and the board follows a path akin to a freeway clover leaf instead of a regular square. There are no partnerships allowed. A player takes a turn by taking a ticket from a ticket roll. A roll of tickets consists of 5 ones, 5 12s, and 4 each of the other tickets. When all the tickets on a roll have been taken, a new roll is loaded. Tickets are randomly ordered on each roll: 1, move 1 bumper car out of pit row, or advance 1 space 2, advance 2 spaces 3, advance 3 spaces and take another card 4, advance 4 spaces 5, advance 5 spaces 6, advance 6 spaces or move 9 spaces backwards 7, advance 7 spaces or switch places with an opponent 8, advance 8 spaces or split the move between 2 bumper cars 9, advance 9 spaces or move 6 spaces backwards 10, advance 10 spaces 11, advance 11 spaces or move 1 space backwards 12, advance 12 spaces or move 1 bumper car out of pit row. Bump'em, similar to the Sorry card in the traditional game. Take 1 bumper car currently in pit row. Choose an opponent's car. Take their place and send them back to pit row. If the player has no cars in pit row, he must pass. The board also comes with oil slicks, which act as the slides. And landing on a person's bumper car will bump them back to pit row. Point play equals, variation rules apply. The winner is decided by achieving a certain amount of points over a span of several games. Points system goes as follows: the winner is decided when one player achieves a set number of points agreed upon by all players before play starts. Variations for faster play include point penalties for certain cards in each player's hand at the end of each set. Video game, a electronic gaming version of Sorry, was released in 1998 as a Sorry computer game. Versions published Basic Edition re-releases Sorry Nostalgia, first version with diamonds, a version with a different board, wood parts and in a collector's box. Sorry Family Game Night Edition. Sorry Fun on the Run Edition. Hasbro's Classics, Sorry Limited Edition. Contained a new box and with diamonds. Hasbro Adventure. The Action Pack, with Twister, Connect 4, and Trouble. Sorry The Greatest Hits, the full pack. Had 5 editions of the game, chosen randomly. Sorry 2013 edition game. Themed editions Note, many of these themed editions have special rules on the 3, 5, 8 and 11 cards that specify special movement rules for players if their color matches the one named on the card. Sorry The Disney Edition. Sorry The Simpsons Edition. Sorry The Spider-Man 3 Edition, Poker Copyright Sorry. Sorry Disney's Splash Mountain Theme Park Collector's Edition. Key quest similar to Sorry, but more Neopets-like. Sorry SpongeBob SquarePants Edition. Sorry Phineas and Ferb, sorry. Madagascar. Equals others sorry. Themed games equals. Note, these are games that use elements of the basic sorry game, but with totally new gameplay. Sorry. Card Revenge, a card game in the style of Uno, but featuring a large electronic pawn that directs certain elements of the game when its head is tapped. Sorry Express. See description below. Sorry. Sliders, a board game where the pawns act as shuffleboard-like tokens using several target boards. Shaken Sorry. Dishna Grab Edition, dice-based game, where the object is to roll enough of your color face to fill your home board. Shaken Sorry. Had a collectible Sorry keychain. Sorry. Spin, a twist or spin of the game. Released July 2010. You Build Sorry, part of Hasbro's You Build series, which had a Lego-like board that allowed for custom paths, and a modified game goal of escorting pawns from the center of the board to your home space. Sorry. Express, Parker Brothers has released a travel version of Sorry. Called Sorry. Express. The game consists of 3 dice, 4 home bases, a start base, and 16 pawns, 4 in each color. Up to 4 players can play this game. To play, each player takes a home base and sets it on a different color, and all of the pawns are put on the start base no matter how many people are playing. The first person rolls all 3 dice and gets one of 4 possibilities for each die. Color pawn the player takes the corresponding color pawn from the start base and, if it matches up with the color of his or her home base, puts it in his or her home section. If not, it is put in his or her waiting area. When there are no more pawns of a particular color in the start base and a player rolls that same color, he can take that color pawn from another player unregistered trademark S waiting area, not his or her home section. Sorry. Take a pawn from the home section of one player unregistered trademark S home base and keep it. Wild Pawn the player may take any color pawn from the start base or waiting areas and keep it. Slide change either one's own home section or someone else's unregistered trademark S home section to a different color. The first person to get 4 pawns of the same color in their home section wins. References. External links, sorry. At Board Game Geek.